Muammar Gaddafi constituted a regime for 40 years where he was the highest authority in Libya, setting aside the debate about the possible lights or shadows of Gaddafi's figure. Libya was at that time one of the richest countries in resources in Africa and had a government that proposed to lead Gaddafi, even with a new common currency for African countries. However, in February of 2011, diverse groups opposing Gaddafi initiated an uprising that turned into a civil war, in which, in turn, the United States and France ended up intervening. After more than 10,000 deaths, Gaddafi ends up captured and publicly lynched. After this intervention in 2014, the groups that overthrew Gaddafi's regime turned on each other in a new civil war up until 2022, which would practically disintegrate the Libyan nation. According to the official version, NATO intervened in Libya to protect civilians in the midst of the conflict. What were the true motivations behind Gaddafi's overthrow? Why did it happen? France and the United States were funding the rebels, including Islamist groups, according to leaked documents. Time after figures about Hillary Clinton on the subject, stay until the end of the video, as today we are going to explore the reasons behind these dramatic events. This is Reynaldo Jose Carrillo Vilches speaking. This is the New Encyclopedia, and for those who don't know, I remind you that we now have the New Encyclopedia in English and the New Encyclopedia in Portuguese. You can give us great support by getting involved on both platforms that you can find below, subscribing to both channels, liking the videos, leaving your comments, and watching the material that has a lot of potential. Without anything else to add, let's start with today's video. The nation of Libya had been a colonial province of the Ottoman Empire, the Italian Empire, and the British Empire, not achieving its independence until 1951 to 1969. The young officer Muammar Gaddafi takes power and would be the supreme ruler of Libya until the year 2011. It is not the purpose of this video to judge the benefit or harm to the Libyan people of more than 40 years of Gaddafi's rule, but to explore the real motivations for his overthrow and the intervention of foreign groups in it. The support, sometimes violent, that Libya gave during the 80s and 90s to groups opposed to the interests of the United States and Europe led to the imposition of sanctions and an economic embargo against the Libyan nation. During that time, even an American bombing in 1986. This speaks of an old rivalry between both groups. And during the early years of the 21st century, Libya would not stop being under the American and European gaze. Despite everything, by the beginning of the 21st century, Libya had been able to overcome various crises of an internal and diplomatic nature. It's important to note that by then Libya was one of the main oil producers in the region, and it also had the largest gold and silver reserves in Africa. Also, since '99, Gaddafi had been the main promoter of a Pan-Africanist movement, as well as promoter of the official creation of the United States of Africa, with a common government based on a model similar to the European Union. One of the manifestations of all this occurs in 2002, when the African Union is founded, which today brings together 55 states of the African continent. By 2009, Gaddafi was elected as president of the African Union and crowned as King of Kings by more than 200 monarchs and leaders of Africa. This Pan-African body aimed to establish its own currency, backed by the gold standard, in order to promote greater economic autonomy and increase trade among African countries, to the detriment of the use of the dollar and other foreign elements, and to the detriment of the famous petrodollar system to be able to trade their resources in another currency. After his appointment as president of the Union was announced, Gaddafi publicly insisted that the sovereign countries of the African continent should establish this new joint government system, already proposed 4 decades ago. With an army, a currency, and a single passport, these were Gaddafi's official words and proposals. This monetary project for the continental bloc was mainly backed by Libya's large economic base. This economic base was supported on one hand by Libya's role as one of the world's largest oil producers, nationalized. In addition, since the 70s, it was also supported by the solidity of the Libyan Investment Authority the largest national sovereign investment fund in Africa, created in the time of Gaddafi and valued at $56 billion. And finally, it was supported by the enormous mineral reserves of gold and silver found in the Federal Reserve of the Central Bank of Libya, quantified at more than 100 tons of gold. It is precisely this amount of resources that allowed Gaddafi to have so much influence in many other poorer African countries, according to numerous scholars on the subject, and leaked documents that we are going to present to you. The fact that one of the main oil producers in the region was looking for an alternative system to the petrodollar to trade its resources, and this formation of a Pan-African bloc with greater political autonomy, its own currency, and a joint foreign policy. And all of this led by a man who was not at all trusted by the West. These would be some initial key elements to understand the intervention that would come shortly after, regardless of whether Gaddafi was a despot or something else. According to these researchers, and as the facts show, NATO does not intervene in countries based on whether they are democratic or not, but based on geopolitics. With all this context presented, we now approach 2010. Although Muammar Gaddafi was still the de facto leader of the country, the relative peace and stability that he had achieved during his term was faltering in the face of discontent from factions aspiring to gain control of the country. Several of these factions opposing Gaddafi and this public information had been financed and supported by NATO for years, especially by France and the United States. Finally, in February of 2011, uprisings in Libya erupted that led to the Libyan civil war. Different opposition groups organized in the so-called National Transitional Council, along with rebel military, rose up against the Gaddafi regime. The Libyan government manages to deal significant defeats to the insurgent armed groups and achieves the pacification of the organized protests in Tripoli. Several African leaders urged Gaddafi to end the internal conflict, with the signing of a peace agreement and the fulfillment of commitments by his government. At the end of the month, Gaddafi accepts the proposal. But the National Council of the Rebels, a provisional organization that weekly brought together sectors of the opposition and was backed by NATO, flatly refused to sign any agreement that did not finally have the removal of Gaddafi from his position as national leader. Between the escalation of violence and the increase in the intensity of the military siege by the rebels in the city of Benghazi, the then French President Nicolas Sarkozy instigated Western hostilities against the government of Muammar Gaddafi and motivated NATO to intervene in Libya under the argument of protecting the Libyan population from a dictator. Prior propaganda campaign in the news media for March 19th, and it was a fait accompli, the military intrusion of Western armies in the Libyan conflict, starting with aerial attacks by France, United Kingdom, and United States on military bases and strategic points of the Libyan army. Western figures like the then Italian President Silvio Berlusconi opposed the military intervention, stating, "I had my hands tied by the vote of my country's parliament. But I was and am against this intervention, which will end in a way that no one knows." This was not a popular uprising because Gaddafi was loved by his people, as I could see when I went to Libya. The NATO invasion of Libya would later be described by multiple personalities and organizations as excessive and useless. Therefore, rather than peace, it brought more conflict for the following years. At the beginning of the conflict, prior to the United Nations resolution on March 19th, Libyan authorities had announced the suspension of hostilities. However, they could not contain with diplomatic movements the attack of the coalition commanded by the United States under the administration of Barack Obama. Over time, fundamental details have been revealed to understand the active participation of the West in the overthrow of Muammar Gaddafi. Beyond the often repeated premise of defending Libyan civilians, in April 2011, details of memos organized by Sidney Blumenthal were revealed. From the conversations held between the United States Secretary of State Hillary Clinton and the French President Nicolas Sarkozy. In this meeting, according to this information, which is public and official, the French leader made his interests very clear: to stop the emerging role of Libya as a power that could replace France as the dominant power in French Africa. It was necessary to guillotine the initiative of a new currency that would topple the hegemony that supports the African franc in the region, increase France's military and political influence on the continent, and also gain greater control within the oil industry. Libya. France was the Western coalition country that invested the most in this war, up to 320 million euros. Such was the importance of this operation that by September of the same year, thanks to the cooperation of Libyan agents sympathetic to France, the Sarkozy government was able to grant 35% of the participation in the Libyan oil industry to the high spheres of French finance. In December of 2015, more than 3,000 private emails from the Secretary of State Hillary Clinton were leaked. In an email dated April 2, 2011, Hillary Clinton emphatically stressed that Libya's large gold and silver reserves were a threat to the interests of Western powers in Africa. In an interview conducted on October 20, 2011, after learning of the capture of Muammar Gaddafi, Hillary Clinton exclaimed with laughter, an adaptation of the famous Roman phrase, "We came, we saw, we conquered," saying, "We came, we saw, he died." For his part, Sidney Blumenthal warns Hillary Clinton in these memos about the possible dangers of a post-Gaddafi Libya. Because there was a growing influence of radical Islamic groups, gaining relevance within the National Transition Council, Islamic groups such as Al-Qaeda. Blumenthal asserted that France and other Western European countries must act quickly to ensure that the new government does not allow Islamic groups to establish local entities, or caliphates, in the oil and gas-producing regions in southeastern Libya. Despite this, the Obama administration's support for the National Transitional Council and Islamist cells was demonstrated in numerous declassified intelligence reports. Journalist Robert Parry defined this Clinton doctrine as quite close in procedures with those carried out by Republican neoconservative sectors under the command of then-President George W. Bush. During the invasion and regime change that took place in Iraq in 2003 to overthrow Saddam Hussein, as well as other interventions in the Middle East during the time, regimes like Hussein's, which contradicted the geopolitical interests of these American groups and their Israeli allies. So that the historical background and the numerous leaked documents make it clear that the ruling class of France and the United States did clearly perceive Gaddafi's regime, to its large reserves of resources, to its leadership over a wide bloc of African nations as a problem for the influence and presence of Western groups in Africa. Once settled in Libyan territory, when the rebellion against Gaddafi broke out, NATO took charge of supplying the rebels with resources, training, and intelligence. The British and French Air Force worked together to bomb the country's military, industrial, and agricultural infrastructure, while also pursuing Gaddafi and his close officials from the air who were trying to lead the fight against the rebels. Finally, an American drone destroys the vehicle from which Gaddafi and his son were traveling. After this, American intelligence agents also give the rebels the location of the Libyan leader, so that he was then captured and lynched to death by these same insurgents, ending more than 40 years of stability. And Libya had experienced, after a long time being a colony and many years being the center of tribal struggles. After his death, Libya would sink into a deep civil conflict between factions of all kinds of ideologies and religions, which still continues to have profound repercussions in Africa and Europe to this day.